Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our fourth webinar of four. Today's topics include a economic and employment update and a question and answer session with us at Flaherty and Hood as labor and employment attorneys. So more specifically, presenting today and answering your questions are myself, Brandon Fitzsimmons, who as a shareholder attorney, I head up the firm's labor, employment, and human resource practice area. And along with me, when they get to present, they can introduce themselves. That'd be Chad Arneson and Christina Petsoulis. So the topics we're covering today is what we do on a day-to-day basis. So now specifically, let's talk about the topics we are going to cover today. First, we'll give a COVID-19 update. One, we'll look at rates and vaccination issues, which really provide context of where the pandemic goes is where we as employers have to go and adjust. Then two, we'll get into, as of today, May 25th, 2021, what are the core requirements you still have to comply with? What were requirements you don't have to comply with? And three, what's some of the updated guidance from the state and federal agencies on what you should be doing as employers? So Christina Petsoulis will be covering that topic. Then I'll jump into and give a quick economic update on what's happening throughout the country and the state, which of course directly impacts you as employers with employment, wages, and other terms of employment. Then we'll get into an employment update. Briefly, what's a mini lay of the land of what's happening in the public sector, in the country and the state. Then after that, the third attorney on the call, Chad Arneson, will give a update on what's happening on the federal level with employment issues. Then two, and it's probably going to be the shortest, is what's happening at the state level. Then we can end it with questions and answers on any of the topics we covered today or anything related to that. Now, mechanically, what are we going to do? Even though we have question and answer session at the end, you will still have the ability in the next slide, as it indicates, is that if you have any questions either during our presentation, you can, at least for me, it's in the bottom center of the screen, select the chat button and submit your questions via chat. So that's how we'll be doing. We'll try to respond to your questions throughout, but again, at the end is where we can have some freewheeling Q&A and questions that all of you have on these topics. So with that brief introduction, again, thanks for joining us, and we'll turn it over now to Christina Petsoulis to give a COVID-19 update.
Thanks, Brandon. So good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Petsoulis. I'm also a labor and employment attorney at the firm. But I also have a background in public health, so I think that's why Brandon likes to assign the COVID stuff to me. So I'll be going over the update, like Brandon said. I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about, just kind of a snapshot of what's been going on in terms of infection and, where it's come with vaccines and everything like that. So this first slide is just a summary of the total cases in Minnesota specifically. So we've had over 500,000 cases confirmed in Minnesota, along with over about 7,000 deaths. So a little bit more of a snapshot in terms of where we've been day to day in terms of confirmed cases. So as you can see, there was a bit of a spike in basically 2020 holiday season, so November, December, and then you can see as, perhaps not so coincidentally, the vaccine comes out, starts getting administered, and we're seeing a reduction in cases confirmed. And this is the US as a whole. It's not totally different than what has happened at the state level, except obviously it's on a greater scale. So we've had 33 million cases in the US confirmed, along with over 500,000 deaths. And this also gives some vaccine data. So this is actually very surprising to me. Over half of the US population, so 60% of adults have at least one vaccine for the whole entire US population, which is pretty impressive. And then this is the Minnesota vaccine snapshot. So this is also pretty impressive considering, when the vaccine actually came out. So we have 2.8 million with at least one vaccine dose, and then we have 2.4 completely vaccinated. And then you can see most of the administering of the vaccine occurred in March and April, and then going down in May. And then these are just a little bit of projections kind of to show us, where are we going and how does this, especially impact the workplace, of course, for our purposes. So as you can see, of course, this is US data, and not different than Minnesota. We had a spike in November and December in the cases, and then slowly went down once the vaccine was administered. And as you can see, so I know it's a little bit faint, but there's a purple line kind of in the middle below this red line, and then there's a green line. So the current projection is the purple line in the middle, and that's showing, of course, cases going down, as continued vaccine administration is going through. But then the green line below it is showing if we have universal mask mandates still, which is showing, of course, it's going to be most effective when everybody wears a mask, but the rates are still going to go down even without masks. And then similar, this is Minnesota. It's really not different at all from the US projection. Again, basically going to zero in terms of cases projected with a mask mandate, but still going substantially down even without masks. So I wanted to move on to governor executive orders at the state level, just to kind of go through what employers are still required to do. So Executive Order 2122, this was issued recently, May 14th, and this was an extension of the COVID peacetime order, which was really the first order that came out in all of COVID back in March 2020. So what Governor Walz had to say was basically, the COVID pandemic still continues, and it still endangers life and property of Minnesota. So they still do want to take a step back and take care of this threat, even though things are going up. So this is basically what the first peacetime order kind of said. Oops, there we go. So basically what this first order said was, adhere to Minnesota OSHA standards and MDH and CDC. And so all of those kind of basic guidelines are still in place, but the one thing that is a little bit different from that first executive order is that the work from home mandate was lifted in April 14th. So it's no longer mandated that people must work from home if they can, but it's recommended now. And then this is a little bit more about the employer requirements. So as you remember, back in June 2020, there was an executive order that came out regarding critical businesses putting a COVID preparedness plan in place. And that plan included, making policies and procedures that assist in identification of sick workers, work hygiene, implementation, workplace ventilation protocols, everything like that. So this order is still in place. It was renewed by some of these orders listed on the slide. So this is important for employers to keep in mind that they still need to follow a preparedness plan and keep updating it with new protocols that the employers want to implement. And then this is a little bit of MDH employer guidance. So it's not that dissimilar from CDC or what executive orders have said. Basically, so strategies to reduce the risk of getting sick. Get vaccinated, of course, number one, that's the most effective. Wear a mask when recommended by MDH or CDC. And if you're not vaccinated, still have that 6 feet requirement, and of course, face covering recommended. So a little bit more MDH guidance, so strategies that can reduce risk of getting sick with transmitting COVID. So this is for vaccinated or unvaccinated people. The MDH recommends washing hands, of course, similar to before. Follow guidance on staying home in terms of quarantine if you were exposed to someone. especially if you're not vaccinated. We'll go a little bit over if you are vaccinated and you were exposed. We'll go over that in a few slides after this. Of course, stay home if you are sick, and I think that's universal for whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. So a little bit more, so whether you're vaccinated or not vaccinated, work from home if possible at this point. That's what the Department of Health is recommending. It's not requiring, again, it's just recommending. And employers must still provide reasonable accommodations under federal and state law. So this is the big question that I think a lot of you are wondering, and we had covered it in a February 2021 webinar that we had completed, but just wanted to give you a refresher on that since it's definitely really a hot topic right now and a lot of questions that I'm sure you have. So can employers require employees to take the COVID vaccine? So the most solid answer that we have is from the EEOC. They came out with guidelines, I believe in December, January of this year. And basically the guidance says employers may require employees to be vaccinated. Now the guidance never said employers can't or shouldn't require vaccination, but it also didn't recommend that they do require vaccination. So we just wanted to go through a few considerations if you guys do want to require the COVID vaccine. So of course there's ADA considerations. On this slide, I just have a little explanation that the administering a COVID vaccine does not constitute a medical exam under ADA because it's not technically seeking information. But if you have some pre-screening questions for the vaccine administration, such as, are you immunosuppressant, or, questions like that, that would impact you having the ability to get the vaccine. Those would be inquiries under the ADA, and it also may elicit information about genetic information under GINA. And then some other guidance that was helpful in this EEOC stated that an unvaccinated individual would constitute, an unvaccinated individual who will definitely expose others to the virus at the workplace could be considered a direct threat under the ADA, and then that's when the employer could remove that individual from the workplace. So some other employer mandate issues that we need to consider. So if the employer is mandating it, there's going to be a question of whether the employer needs to pay for that vaccine. Also, the employer may be liable for injuries that result under workers' compensation. And it's not on this slide, but another consideration too is what to do with time off after a vaccine is administered. People are often sick afterwards, so that might play a role in requiring the vaccine. Another one, of course, for a lot of you, a union agreement might be required for unionized employees if the employer does want to require the vaccine. So just a little bit more on kind of the raw legal stuff in terms of mandate exceptions. So of course, like I spoke before, the ADA is definitely an exception. Reasonable accommodations are a consideration. Also Title VII, religious accommodation. Under this, the employees can refuse to receive the COVID vaccine if they have a sincerely held religious belief. And generally, employers must provide an accommodation unless doing so would pose an undue hardship. And if no reasonable accommodation is possible, then the employer may exclude the employee from the workplace in this scenario. And then this is just a little bit more information for kind of data regarding vaccines. So employers questioning employees about vaccine status. So of course, the first thing that an employer is going to need if they are going to ask questions about an employee's vaccine status is a justification. Consider what is the purpose of asking about vaccine status and what you're going to do with that information. Thinking about the actual data, kind of considerations. If you are going to ask questions, there needs to be a Tennyson warning. And then also this would be classified as private data. So there would need to be consent to divulge any names. You know, if there happens to be a data request in the future, there's going to be, you know, a need to somehow individualize that data. And then also there's some discrimination concerns, you know, similar to the past slide, you know, religion, and that includes the First Amendment. And so if you all have questions about that, we can, of course, Flaherty and Hood can counsel you all on that. So here's a survey question that I want you all to participate in. So with COVID-19 vaccines, which of the following apply to you? You're not asking or requiring vaccinations. You're simply encouraging vaccines, asking about it but not requiring vaccines, or asking about and requiring vaccinations. So go ahead and submit your answer, and then I can pull up the data. All right, so it looks like we're kind of tied for the first two. So 42% not asking or requiring vaccinations, and then secondly, simply encouraging vaccines. Okay, it's good. Okay, so I'm going to move on to quarantine now. So with regard to quarantine, so it's still recommended for non-vaccinated individuals, probably unsurprisingly. So that would be if people are exposed, or this is a big one, travel outside of Minnesota other than crossing the border for work. So this is kind of a big issue, you know, non-vaccinated individuals, they're going to have to quarantine after travel. So that obviously might impact the workplace on when, you know, employees can come to work. The second thing, if someone has completed COVID vaccination and is exposed, they do not need to quarantine if each of the following are true. So you do not, if you're vaccinated, you do not need to quarantine unless the COVID exposure was at least 14 days after their vaccination was completed. So it would be within that window when your vaccine is not 100% effective yet. And you do not currently have symptoms of COVID. So here's another survey question. It's yes or no. Are you enforcing quarantine or stay away from work recommendations for employees who travel outside of the state for personal reasons? Wow, no. Overwhelmingly no. Okay. Okay, that's good. We can talk about that too in our Q&A. Okay, so on to masks, another hot topic. So following the CDC guidance that I believe came out on May 13th, this is an executive order. So given the CDC's new guidance, our progress on vaccine administration and encouraging trends in our key public health risk metrics, this executive order lifts the face covering requirements. So at the state level, the governor removed the mask mandate. Now, as you can see also on this slide, so private businesses and local municipalities may still put in a face covering requirement. So it's important for, you know, cities to understand what the local government is enforcing. You know, they might not have lifted the mask requirements. So in these areas, masks are still required, even though it's not required at the state level. So this was the CDC guidance I was talking about on the previous slide. This was kind of a bombshell for everybody. Fully vaccinated people do not need to wear a mask, except where required by federal, state, local, and other rules and regulations, including local business and workplace guidance. So similar to what the executive order said, masks are not required for vaccinated people. And then this is a little bit of MDH guidance. So people who are fully vaccinated, not required to wear a face covering indoors or outdoors, including in the following situations. So in settings where high risk of COVID spread. So that would be like healthcare settings, homeless shelters. People, even if they are vaccinated, will need to wear a mask. And then also for people with COVID symptoms. And then again, certain settings where there may be some differing mask requirements at the federal, state, and local level. And then again, businesses and entities can also set their own face covering rules. So that means that, again, employers can set their own rules with regard to requiring masks, even though either the local government or the state government is not requiring masks. So this is just a little bottom line on masks. So private businesses and local governments can still put in face covering requirements, but you should see where the local government has lifted the mask mandate. So employers may continue to require employees to wear face masks as CDC guidelines, MDH guidance, and the state level EOs do not preclude employers enforcing such safety rules. But so this is important to pause on. So if employees do, so if the employer does decide to require face masks and the employees are not obeying those rules, we recommend just treating that failure to obey like any other performance issue, because it really is, up to the employer to put in the policies in terms of safety on their own. So, and then another point I wanted to bring up was that employers should update the preparedness plan, like I was talking about before. It's still required at the state level, but the employers should really be updating it if they are or are not requiring masks. And then employers must still require to legally maintain safe and healthy workplace, regardless of whether masks are required. So then one last survey question, when masks are not required by law or other governing authority, which of the following apply? Okay, only encouraging use for those who are sick is the majority. We've also had a little bit of sprinkling of only requiring indoors for certain larger gatherings. Okay, and we can talk more about that in Q&A too. So I will turn it over to Brandon to go over the economic update. Oh, Brandon, you're on mute.
There we go. All right, commercial moment. So I'll cover two things. One is the economic update, and then two is we'll talk about more specifically what's happening on the employment end. So with that and the economic update, and this is all this flows from, as we put in our third slide in this, from Minnesota Management and Budget as part of their economic forecast and budget forecast. So though this was back from their February forecast, if you really look at the economic data, it's probably still going to be pretty much on target. So what does this chart show? It shows what the state saying has been and is projected to be the gross domestic product in the country. Really, that's the best measure of where the economy overall is going. So the gray bars are what they projected going back in November. The blue bars are what they projected in February, and we'll talk about why. So if you look at the bottom, there are the years. So again, no surprise, in 2020 with the pandemic and all the resulting impacts, the economy contracted by about 3.5%. Now for 2021, the state really does project the US economy to go gangbusters at 5.7%, almost double what they even thought a few months earlier in November with the pandemic. Then in 22, they expect further expansion of 4.1% 22, then a little bit of leveling off and growth in 23, 24, and 25. So again, that's relevant to all of you when it comes to jobs and budgeting. And this is the main impetus for how the state projects where their budget's going. Then we look at the reasons why. So why did their economic outlook improve going from November to February, which again is going to impact you and your unit of government? One, the substantial, as Chad will talk about, federal pandemic relief. We've had a few bills since the pandemic has started where money is directly flowing to all of you as government entities. Two, there's higher than expected consumer spending in early 2021, which of course coincided with what is the goal of those second round of stimulus checks in the federal legislation of money going directly to consumers to spend it. And it, per the state, sounds like they did. Three, the higher than expected economic growth in the last quarter of 2020, again, fueled by consumer spending. Four, the COVID-19 rates were improving, which maybe we didn't know as much pre-vaccination in November, but you can see, as Christina articulated, there's a clear leveling off and potential decline here soon in COVID-19 cases. And that corresponds with the relaxing, as we can see, as Christina talked about, even at the state level with restrictions on personal activity. Then finally, progress in national vaccinations. As Christina articulated, about 60% of the eligible adult population has been vaccinated. They say, okay, that's good, but what are some cautions? And we always say too, not only will this help you inform where you go in the employment and especially the compensation end, but two, remember, these are talking points. You know, I'll talk about in the last portion of this, you know, what are we hearing from employees for unions? These are also talking points you should bring with your councils or other or commissions or other governing bodies and employees and unions. One is volatile and uncertain. Two, where the pandemic goes is clearly where the economy is going to go. Three, it assumes infections continue to recede, which they are, but we did have our spike in mid-January 2021. And the state does expect widespread effective vaccination of the population will be basically achieved by fall, except of course at this point, except for those under 12. So again, those are the cautionary notes that should shape what you do. So then we look at what's another, you know, meaningful thing in the employment end or in union negotiations, even though it's less meaningful, and that is how are prices changing? What's the measure of inflation or deflation in the country? So here's what the state is predicting, that in 2021, surprisingly, we won't see a spike, though prices stagnate in 2020. The spike they're predicting, and we're even hearing from the Federal Reserve, who sets interest rates, which also impacts the economy, that inflation will only be about 2% in 21. And really, that's pretty consistent going onward for the next 4 years. So from your end as government entities, that means the price of goods, even though you have a little bit different economic measure, is probably going to be pretty flat. And two is, this helps your argument when you're discussing wage increases, especially at the negotiating table with unions, that look at the projected price of goods going out for the next 5 years are around the 2-ish%, which is really, you know, it's tough to even call that inflation. If it is, it's extremely mild. Then we get to, you know, where's Minnesota going? What is the state saying about that? They're saying the pandemic-induced downturn that began, of course, in February 2020 brought severe disruption in Minnesota's economy. They talked about, obviously, the state, like all of you as government entities, experienced job and wage income losses. The labor force just shrunk. The number of people looking for work and working was reduced. Consumer spending plummeted, and businesses simply closed. But what they do say is those job and wage losses of 2020 will be followed by positive employment and wage growth. And of course, that's due to the improved U.S. economic outlook, which they really glom onto all the federal pandemic relief spending going to a lot of you as government entities that, again, Chad will talk about. So, you know, what's some of the data? Again, talking point shapes where are we at. So going left to right, what is this? The unemployment rate in Minnesota versus the US, looking at where it was in April, the most recent data that we have compared to March, and also comparing where we were comparing April of 21 to 2020 to April 19. So what does this show? If you look at the yellow highlights there in Minnesota, our unemployment rate is less than half of what it was going backwards and basically the peak of the economic downturn, whereas 9.1%, now it's 4.1. But we do know the economy is substantially improving, but this is a bellwether that we're still not where we were 2 years ago as of April 19, where unemployment was at 3.1%. So again, we're improving, but we're not there yet. And again, I know a lot of you in the governmental end are seeing that. So that's unemployment rate. Now let's talk about jobs. Where are we at with that specifically? So first at the top is all jobs in the country and the state. And secondly is where our government, you as government employers, where are you at with the total number of people working in the government sector? So first, I'll just highlight those items in bold at the top for all jobs throughout the state. Is that if you compare April 20, the downturn, to April 21, we've had an increase. That means 230,000 jobs are back. So there's a 9% growth comparing 20 to 21. However, if you compare on the far right where we're at in April 21, again, compared to where we're in April 19, obviously pre-pandemic, anything in a solid economy, overall in the state, we still have about 5.5% less jobs overall, number of people employed than we did in April 19. So again, what does it show? Improving substantially, but we're still not where we're at to full economic recovery. Then we look at government jobs, pretty similar, though it doesn't always mirror what's happening overall in the state and country at the bottom there. If you look at the state, again, we've seen a milder uptick in the number of government jobs that have come back, you know, in our pandemic recovery. So right now we've got an increase in government jobs of 12,000 comparing April 21 to 20. But again, similar to all other jobs in the state, there's still over 15,000 less people employed in the government sector in the state, which means we're still about 3.7% less. U.S. government entities overall are employing 3.7% less people. Again, it shows all of you as government entities, you still have not recovered, though your recovery's been a little better than where we were at, even going backward to April 2019. So now that's the overall economy. Now let's talk about what's happening in the employment end of things. So with that, one thing we rely on is the Center for State and Local Government Excellence does a good survey every year of what's happening with all of you as governments in the state and local end of things throughout the country. So I thought they pretty well distilled it, what's happened in 2021, because in reality, for our numerous government clients in the state, this is what we've seen. As the data just showed, what's bullet point one that they put in their summary? Job cuts have returned, but they've not fully returned. So you're still not back to full gainful employment like you were pre-pandemic. Secondly, the pandemic's really forced us not only short-term, but probably a lot of you long-term, as we've talked about in other webinars, to have more flexible employment practices. What does that mean? That's two things. One, it's either in your on site, in person, you're a little more flexible in schedule and hours. And again, the pandemic's driven that, but also the more younger generation coming into the workforce with millennials and Generation Z. Secondly, of course, as we've talked about, remote work. So we don't think, as the state Center for State and Local Government Excellence thinks, that's just not a pandemic thing. We think there'll be a little bit more of a push for remote work structurally and long term. Third, recruiting is a challenge. Bottom line is, what are the tough? Generally, it's tough for you in the public sector, but where's the core? The top two things which we see in our end too, one is getting healthcare jobs, getting those jobs filled, and two, of course, the prevalent one, corrections and policing. So anything law enforcement related, it's tough for you to recruit folks. Then what's the fourth main thing that they're seeing throughout the country is any benefit changes. The main focus right now is what you're getting employees to contribute. So on that quick side note, not a separate slide, a lot of you who you've worked with in negotiations, what's the core thing? Obviously with benefits, the biggest cost driver is health insurance, and how you structure your contribution is important. It's not just getting more employee contributions, but it's also getting the right language in place. As you know, we're a big advocate, and we've worked with a lot of you, getting flat dollar amount contributions, for example, into labor contracts or policies for what the employer contributes, then will correspondingly dictate what the employees contribute. So that's an important thing to do. So try to wipe out the automatic percentage increases, instead look for flat dollar amounts. So let's go back. One thing we always get updates on are, what are all of you doing when it comes to remote work? So one, are you going back to normal with little to no remote work? Are you considering a hybrid for some employees, but overall everybody's just on site? Or are you considering a permanent expansion of remote work? So survey says, looks like about 45% of you are still going back to the way things were pre-pandemic, but again, a much larger percentage than pre-pandemic, about 40%, almost equal, are looking at some hybrid, and very few of you are looking at some permanent expansion to remote work. So again, we'll put guidance out and continually ask folks for. So now what else, what's happening on the wage end for all of you as government employers when we get the next slide up? There we go. So what is this show going left to right? We put in there it's law enforcement, but I'll throw it out there. This is really the bellwether where all of you are going with general wage increases as Minnesota units of government, primarily focused on local governments. This is the average general wage increase, which again excludes step increases, performance pay, any other movements within the range. Also loosely known, though we don't like the term, cost of living adjustments. So really, what we've seen is stagnation in what you're doing in 21, 22, and 23. And again, this just shows what has been settled and established for employees. So obviously, pre-pandemic in 2020, most of you settled before that occurred in March. So again, we see a higher general wage increase in 2020 of 2.82%. 2021, that's where we started to see the decline. When you're realizing the impacts of the pandemic, it shrunk to 2.61%. In 2022 and 23, right now, we don't have the best data. You know, as you can see, our sample size is not large because a lot of you have been established or settled on it, but we're focused on the 22 number, and interestingly, a little less, but really statistically probably close to the same of about 2.55%. But what we are seeing at the bottom, we put in, of our respondents, what percent gave increases in certain ranges. So again, you know, well over 90% of you are 2% plus. So we're not talking like we thought when the pandemic started, zeros or ones. But we are seeing a pretty equitable split between those giving a 2 to 2.99% versus 3% plus. So again, we see that is steady even going out to 23 with our small sample size. So again, all of you use this as a guide to a quick benchmark. All right, where might we want to go with our general wage increase in addition to the other compensation? So this is where Minnesota local governments are at. Then the next slide, we'll talk about, okay, that's what you're giving or settling on. But now, what's happening in the end with interest arbitration? Again, a quick side note, one, they're rare, but two, by law, if you have a union, one or more in your entity, and they are either supervisory, confidential, or law enforcement, they have a right to take you into interest arbitration who can establish what your wage increase will be. So really about all we ever see it in is law enforcement. And as you can tell, we first focus on what are the number of interest arbitration awards that are published by BMS, where all awards have to go to. As you can tell, especially with the pandemic, especially with the PR issues with law enforcement, they've really plummeted. So really, they're not as much a bellwether as they used to be. You can tell just looking at the number of awards. For contract year 2020, there were 12, 21 where there were 7. For contract year 22, we really don't have much of a statistical sample. But one of the drivers beyond what I mentioned is the unions generally aren't getting anything above what we showed you the general wage increases were on average statewide. So as you can see, arbitrators awarded about an average of 2.5% in 22, less in 21 of 2.32%, and with the few that have issued awards for contract year 22, it's 2.5. So again, what unions are getting is less than what the wage increases are for all of you at the table. So again, we still think they're going to be rare, but if you want to look at bottom line, what could be happening, they're always a good bellwether. So now we talked about what you've settled. We talked about arbitration awards. Now let's just talk about a little bit practically, what are we seeing anecdotally and specifically at the table with unions and employees. So before we get there though, let's look at the survey group here. What general wage increases are you considering or settled on for 22? We've got the specific ranges there. So if you just want to input what you're looking at or have settled for 2022. So survey says, again, no surprise, consistent with the data. About half of you are in the 2 to 2.5% range and 27% in the 2.5 to 2.99. So interesting. We do think that will be a bellwether that we're going to see things probably closer to the 2.5 than even probably 2.75. But we'll talk about practically what our unions and employees looking at. Next question is 2023. As you can tell, same question, but we even have the option too early. Who knows? So that is an option here. So what have you settled or looking at for 2023, if anything? So survey says, again, no surprise, 2/3 of you too early to tell, 16% of you at the 2 to 2.5. So again, we're probably going to see consistency unless the economy really takes off and your budget situations look better than they are. So next slide. So practically, all right, we've given you a lot of data. That's good. Now, what are we advising our clients on? What are we seeing at the tables from unions and employees? So one, you've seen the data. General wage increases are trending upwards from pandemic post, but really not that much. So interesting, we'll see where it goes. That's where all of you are at. Two is though, we all know now that things are looking better economically and with your finances, at least at the peak than they were at the peak of the pandemic. A lot of you just to recruit, retain, like the Center for State and Local Government Excellence articulated, a lot of you are going to have to look at the market now. So we can, first focus on our budget. A lot easier to do the pandemic and sell your wage increase. But now we need to probably get a little more market competitive, and or a lot of you are doing overhauls of your job classes, titles, and job descriptions, and compensation, looking at your overall structure. So again, during the pandemic, yep, that stagnated. Data's not that relevant. We wanted to limp through. But now that, again, economies is better, finances are better, a lot more you're looking at overhaul either through market survey or full-fledged class and comp reviews and studies. Again, we're seeing that at our end, working with a lot more of our local governments on that. Three is, what we want to do is, especially with the younger generation, ensure that beyond the general wage increases, there's some continual wage movement. And it's not just if you've been there 20 years, you're going to get it, but a little earlier, even if you incrementalize it. Again, the younger generation studies show, we've done other webinars, that they want some continual wage movement within your specific pay ranges. Fourth, is the data shows right now, unlike a webinar we put on last year when we were sort of at the peak of the pandemic plummet in the economy and finances, it's more difficult short-term to argue now your inability to pay to mitigate the wage increases that you think you can afford with employees or unions. But one thing, again, we want you to utilize this not only to shape what you may look at for wages, but as talking points. A lot of the unions are saying, well, look you're getting flushed with cash. Look at all this money flowing in from the federal government, all this money flowing in from the state for cities and counties relying on state aid. Looks like we're going to be looking okay for that. But what you have to emphasize, that was one-time money because things tanked. So this is just almost just to get us back to a baseline. So one, it shapes what you do, but two, that's your talking point that, the state and federal government have not locked in all this extra money in the future. So again, emphasize the one-time component of that. Then what you need is more, as we talked about in our last webinar, some more creativity in recruitment and retention from the compensation end, even if it's just one time for that specific employee or applicant. Some of you are looking at sign-on lump sums. Again, it's rare, but we wouldn't be surprised, even in the public sector, where, let's face it, we're always a little bit behind the private sector, just because, with how we're financed, and we can't always effectively nimbly compete within sign-on lump sum payments just for coming on board. Two is performance merit pay. Again, a big animal in the public sector, especially in the unionized environment. But again, we're seeing maybe an uptick, at least some of you looking at soft performance pay, which is if you satisfactorily perform, you get step increases. It's not just solely based on Nope, sorry, and I'll try to get back to the slides there. I was jumping around. Uh, 3 is, education tuition reimbursement. This seems to be a lot bigger deal to newer employees than it was. So a lot of you should look at that. Thankfully, it's one-time money, and it doesn't have all the roll-up costs like other generalized, allowances and/or base pay increases do. 4 is more paid time off. Again, management doesn't like it, especially in the law enforcement world, but somehow we always see a bigger push for that. 5 is to, we all can't afford performance merit pay and these other things we're talking about. But what you can do is expand your list, even if your contracts get longer or policies get longer, is special assignment or work pay. So if they're doing some special assignment, especially in the law enforcement world is good at this, a lot of you can look at it because, again, it's financially not a big hit. Because 1, it's a lot lesser amount than a general wage increase. And 2 is it's usually just targeted to a much smaller subset. But again, if you can't necessarily, if you don't have much upward movement for promotions and development within your organization, maybe look at rewarding people who are taking on additional duties. Now, well defined when they get it, what the amount is, but again, this can help you as a local governments. It's not as prevalent in the private sector. Look at those special assignment work pay. So again, this is just the anecdotal, what are we experiencing, seeing, and hearing on things for you to think about that can shape where you want to go with compensation. So we've talked about economy, we talked about employment, we've talked about wages. Now we shift back a little more to raw legal, and let's get a quick nutshell of where we're at the federal and state government. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chad to run with those topics.
All right, good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chad Arneson. I'm also a labor and employment attorney at Flaherty and Hood. For those that were unable to join for our the last webinar that I participated in, I'm a former law enforcement officer in the state of Minnesota, as well as an officer in the Minnesota Army National Guard. Here to talk to you about some federal and state updates and exactly what those updates mean in the perspective of labor and employment. All right, so biggest update obviously in the last year is that the United States has elected a new president, President Joe Biden. What exactly does that mean in the labor and employment perspective? First of all, to kind of put him in a nutshell, he's very, very, very pro-labor. For those of you who have paid attention to any of his campaign or his platform, a lot of it rests on COVID-19 changes, a lot of campaigning regarding minimum wage, labor relations, as well as pay equity. So exactly what for COVID-19? First of all, looking at federal assistance and vaccine distribution, as well as economic stimulus in the form of checks and tax relief. For minimum wage, looking into different considerations for raising the minimum wage for $15 an hour, as well as a mandate for $15 an hour for federal contractors. In terms of labor relations, encouraging and incentivizing unionization as well as collective bargaining. And as mentioned before, the independent contractor status, especially in the federal government, has that $15 minimum wage mandate. So what's on the horizon with some new federal legislation? Biggest legislation in terms of labor and employment, obviously the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. 3 big things really came out of that are going to be affecting local governments. First of all, as many of you may have been notified or have already experienced, the COBRA subsidized continuation, also known as Section 9501. Effectively, what this does is it mandates an offering of continued COBRA coverage, as well as subsidies for certain eligible former employees who have an eligibility period that lasts until at least April 1st, 2021, with a continuation out to September 30th, with possibilities for federal subsidization. The law also imposes some penalties on public employers who fail to properly notify or timely notify their eligible employees. So what exactly does that mean for you? First of all, if you haven't been able to do a review on certain former employees who may be eligible for continued coverage or possibly subsidized coverage, that's something that you may need to look at. Also coming out of ARPA is tax credits for providing FFCRA paid sick and family leave, which grants eligible governments Medicare tax payroll tax credits if they voluntarily provide paid leave consistent with certain federal legislation. Generally, what it does is it offers incentives to local governments to mirror certain federal requirements in order to encourage uses of those certain offerings. The eligible entities include state, territory, county, tribal, and specifically municipal governments. And then finally, the big one is the state and local fiscal recovery funds plans. So what the legislature has done is taken, they've allocated $350 billion to help provide relief to certain governments, local and state governments. For the state of Minnesota, we're looking at just short of $5 billion for the actual state of Minnesota, as well as smaller Minnesota units of government. What exactly are some of these eligible uses that can qualify for relief? Generally, anything that has a strong nexus to revenue and costs associated with COVID-19. So public health expenditures, things such as raising of testing sites, lost revenue in the public sector, providing any sort of premium pay for certain employees who were necessary or essential during the COVID-19 pandemic and still continue to be essential, but additionally, as well as investing in certain infrastructure such as water and sewer. There is a deadline to spend, and that deadline has been set for December 31st, 2024. All right, so what's some legislation that may move up here on the horizon? There is a discussion of 12 weeks of federally paid FMLA leave, as well as what we had previously discussed as an increase in minimum wage potentially to $15 an hour at the federal level. Some immigration reform, as well as Paycheck Fairness and Equity Act, with some additional protections for pregnant workers. And additionally, as the Supreme Court had brought up earlier this last year, certain prohibitions on sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, with the Supreme Court finding in the case of Bostock that sexual orientation is now a protected class at the federal level. So from the Office of Joe Biden, what are some potential future executive orders? Generally looking at some of the executive orders he's already done, providing certain guidance to some of his executive agencies and what that could mean for further executive action. First of all, President Biden has directed the Department of Labor to provide some guidance on possible exceptions for workers who receive unsafe working conditions in order to receive their unemployment insurance. He is currently doing a minimum wage review in addition to the $15 an hour minimum wage for federal contractors, directing the Office of Personnel Management to develop recommendations. And then finally, ordering OSHA to revise its guidance on workplace safety and launching a national program to increase enforcement on particular workplace violations. So what exactly does this federal executive action mean for state and local governments? Well, first of all, generally, as mentioned before, these can filter down into actual action at the federal level. And then obviously, action at the federal level tends to act as templates for smaller units of government. So we could be looking at some of these executive orders coming out of the Office of President Biden and seeing similar sort of action coming from the Office of Governor Walz. All right, quick update on the state. All right, so for the budget for the fiscal years of 2022 to 23, looking at a $2.25 billion balance, which is a surplus plus ARP flexible dollars. Legislative leaders and the governor have set certain targets, $1.3 billion for net new general fund spending, $2.8 billion on federal spending. And there will be a special session that date is yet to be determined to approve the actual budget. And some state legislation, what is passed. First of all, an omnibus pension bill generally that has gone through the Minnesota House and is looking at going to the Ways and Means Committee for additional consideration. Who's generally wrapped up in this sort of pension bill? In terms of public employees, there's several, mostly most of the changes looking at firefighters, 911 operators, our dispatchers as well as teachers. And then additionally, a workers' compensation update, which extends a rebuttable presumption for COVID-19 diagnosis and public safety workers would be covered under workers' compensation laws. Some other potential legislation that may be on the rise at the state level, obviously police reform is a big hot ticket item right now, which we may be looking at some discussion in the legislature. And then certain things related to COVID-19. Primarily a vaccination discrimination has been discussed, as Christina had discussed it her prior. There are several different sort of liberty considerations that need to be balanced with state powers, such as First Amendment considerations, individual rights to elect their own sort of healthcare, and balancing that with exactly what the state can do, and as well as public employers in terms of how they can actually balance workplace safety along with considerations of liberty for individuals who are receiving vaccinations. And then additionally, expanding categories of employees who are subject to workers' compensation, that rebuttable presumption, as we had just discussed. All right, we'll now extend over to questions.
All right, so with that, mechanically what we'll do, so if you have questions, again, if you want to submit them via chat, that'd be appreciated. So, what's a reminder? Obviously, it's a good summary. What did we go over today? And if Chad, you just want to go to the next screen. So as I said, submit by chat, and then the next screen, full circle. I'll just dust off the administrative thing, related to these topics. We'll make the webinar, both the slides and this recording available to all of you after this, so you will get an email with that. So again, what are we willing to take questions on? But just so you know, so we don't have a Minnesota moment, and we do have some questions ready that we've heard that we'll answer. But anything related to COVID-19, especially the employment requirements and guidance, what does all this, discussion of the economy mean? Where's it's going to go? Employment, what are some trending topics? What's compensation? And hey, what's going on at the federal, state level? So with that said, if anybody's got a question, I'll just dust off administratively what we've already seen by chat, but one of them related to the preparedness plan, with a note that the state's not updated their plan, which they really haven't. But what we have been trying to do on our end, from the CGMC level, that we can put out an update. We did after the mask requirement was in place, but we will likely update it now. Now that masks aren't required, we're probably going to update it so that for those of you who want, to at least recommend it, we'll add appropriate language for that. So there's a question, I can jump to Christina, that how strongly is everyone encouraging their unvaccinated employees to mask indoors? So Christina, what does the data show? What are you seeing? What are you hearing on that end?
In terms of employers requiring at this time?
That's right, for mask indoors, or at least encouraging. So, surveys showed, well, people aren't requiring it, but, what's your advice and what are you seeing on encouraging or recommending?
So we're seeing a lot of employers going the recommending route, just because with requiring, the law is a little bit, we have our EEOC guidelines, but we don't really have any, clear legal direction in terms of, how these issues could play out. There's a lot of ADA considerations, there's the asking of data considerations and things like that. So I think at this point, most employers are doing the recommendation route. And from our standpoint, if you want to require, I think it would be a good idea to talk to city attorney or us, just so we can really play out the scenario. This is obviously a lawyer answer, but it really just depends on, the business necessity and things at the actual workforce level, and the type of people that you're requiring to take the vaccine. So you can talk more about requiring with us, but at this point, we would say, recommending is more the route to go.
Then a related question on that is, is there a risk if they recommend it instead of requiring it? So does that expose an employer to more liability, or what are legal issues with that?
We're not really seeing any issues with recommending at this point. It doesn't implicate any ADA asking questions about genetic information or anything like that. So recommending is from what we've seen so far, is a pretty safe route to go.
So Christina, what are any other COVID-19 related issues or questions that you think we haven't addressed that you're hearing?
So masks, with regard to masks, so just keep in mind, again, businesses can and cities can require the masks, even if state or local aren't requiring it. So that's something to keep in mind. But again, if you do decide to go the route of requiring masks, then that should really be added to the COVID preparedness plan.
All right, and we've got another question here. Looks like in my end, there's a lack of workers. This individual asked a question, or let me step back. Christina, one question we had in your purview is, can employers offer incentives to employees to get vaccinated?
That's not something that I've totally seen yet, and don't necessarily know the ramifications of that. I don't know, Brandon, do you have any thoughts off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think we'll distill it as that, you see a little bit of that in the private sector, but we're seeing just about none in the public sector. Now, we could argue it's a legal entitlement, but the bottom line, what's about the only incentive or benefit we're seeing is that they just allow their employees time off, clearly be more flexible with their current paid leave time off, or potentially as part of their COVID leave banks that a lot of you set up that are even independent or supplementary to the former federal leave. So that's about all we're seeing. But again, that's still incentive that, hey, bottom line, you're going to get paid to go get your vaccination. We're not paying you, above and beyond what you already get. So that's about the only incentive we're really seeing in the public sector. And I'm sorry, Christina, it's obviously you've got the hot topic here, but there's another question. Well, they're complaining here. Let me try to keep up. Good, keep going. Is that, if individuals travel for business and they're not vaccinated, what are employers doing, or what's your advice? Quarantine or not, or do we hang on that exception that says, oh, you don't have to? What's the advice?
Well, so what MDH has recommended is that people who are traveling outside of the state that are unvaccinated should quarantine. So we would recommend that there should be, a little bit of quarantine time for people who are traveling related to business outside the state. But the other issue that brings to mind is, this bigger issue of how do we know who is vaccinated, who is unvaccinated? And, that kind of brings a whole new host of questions in terms of the ADA and asking, questions about things that would elicit, a response related to a disability. So that's kind of an area of consideration. So yeah, Brandon, any other thoughts on that?
No, I think you covered it well, but we get practical reality is, we're not seeing, a lot of you are border cities. We work a lot in border in North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, our 5-state area, and we get it. We're not seeing the quarantine because you know, even though it's rare, you know, if you're up in Moorhead, we had you go to Fargo for, you know, a training. No, those people aren't being quarantined. But we're saying is look at, especially to cover yourself, not only for the public health purpose, but liability purposes, look at, you still have to follow all other precautions we have, but we're not going to force you to quarantine if you cross the Red River or the St. Croix River to another state. So again, balance that with some practical realities, still take precautions. And here I've got another question. We're bouncing topics a little bit, but again, I started articulating that, you know, one entity talked about lack of workers, especially for some higher level professional indication. You know, opinion is, well, when there's generous UI benefits, that's not, you know, a good motivator for people to get back in the workforce. So related to that, do you think the state or federal government's going to back off their expanded UI benefits in the future? Yeah, I think so. Obviously not currently, not under this administration, but, you know, if the economy continues to hum, even though we're not fully back, and, you know, per the data I showed, we could be hopefully fully back, you know, this could be come early 2022, we might be back to where we were employment and economically. If that's the case, we will be. Clearly, those expanded benefits will be off, but I don't know. I think they're taking a real conservative approach. And part of it is not just data, let's face it, it's politics. It doesn't look good for a Democratic administration who talked about, you know, saving, getting folks a security net who are covering the pandemic to yank it. So full circle, conservatively, I still think for at least a few more months we'll have those expanded benefits. Another question we have is, again, Christina, we're back to you. Welcome to the Northland. We got people with cabins in Wisconsin. They shoot there for the weekend. Hey, and again, welcome to Minnesota. We love our cabins, even if it's you know, across in Wisconsin. Are you saying that we've got to quarantine somebody who goes every weekend to the Wisconsin? Then we're not going to see them all summer. How's that going to work?
Right. Well, I think, you know, that goes back to what Brandon was saying about, you know, just the practical reality, you know, going to Wisconsin to a cabin, is that really, you know, considered crossing state lines? I mean, somebody could go the same distance going to International Falls from Rochester, and it would be further than someone going to their cabin in Wisconsin. So I think there's just, you know, those practical considerations to take into account. You know, maybe instead of having a policy that says state lines, say rather, you know, taking a flight to New York or taking a flight to California. That's more of a distinguishing kind of factor, I think. Yeah.
All right, and Chad, back to you. You know, we talked about expansion of unemployment benefits. I mean, are we still going to see continuation of benefits or new laws that are COVID related, or you think this is pretty much it? You know, they went all in with combined almost trillions of dollars a package. Where's the federal government going to go? Have they relieved, in their view, relieve folks enough from the pandemic, or is there going to be more to come?
I think we're still going to see some coming up in the future. Specifically, I think one of the big ones is going to be hashing out exactly what is good, a proper balance between individual liberty and an employer's right to create a reasonably safe workplace. And I think that's probably going to be the biggest area of law that's going to be continuing for some time. Specifically, if things go into the courts, you know, those types of legal ordeals tend to take durations of years in order to sort out. But in terms of new law, I don't think we're going to be seeing a whole lot more as the pandemic starts to slow down.
And bouncing a little back to something I covered was, okay, we talked about, yeah, there's a lack of number of employees, but you all want more employees, especially now, unlike last year, where your facilities, your recreational facilities, your community pools are going to be open up. We just can't find people who are motivated because now things are a lot more competitive economically on the wage front. So this individual already brought it up, within their comment / question is, well, we're probably going to have to go, especially for these recreational summer jobs, we're going to have to go lower than the 16-year-olds we're looking at in this specific cities, looking at hiring 14 and 15-year-olds. So yeah, it's not just can we keep up with the Joneses in wages, which may not be sustainable, but maybe we have to expand the folks we're looking for can we go after those early retirees to come back? We've seen that, the law enforcement officer, the police chief literally comes back and mows lawns, they've severed employment. It's been a 6-month gap, won't impact their PRA. They come back to mow lawns for the summer. So maybe again, we all talk about fancy ways to recruit, but again, especially for a lot of you in your community, we've got a pool potentially 14 and 15-year-olds and retirees who are probably ready, willing, and able to take on these recreational jobs, especially when a lot of you, what we're hearing, there's just more demand. Folks had a year off from the recreational end, so they'll be back and paying for services. So let's look at try to be again creative in who we're going to recruit, especially for those seasonal type jobs. So Chad, what else are you seeing federal, state? What do you find as other relevant questions that we should talk about with what's evolving on the legal end?
Well, I think probably the big one is going to be figuring, especially for local governments, is going to be figuring out some of the gray area on who exactly is qualified for some of this continued COBRA coverage. One of the big disqualifying factors there is anybody who's been voluntarily terminated. Well, what exactly does voluntarily terminated mean? In terms of how the federal government is looking at this, they're looking at some old IRS guidance back from 2009, which kind of separates into 3 things. You need a separation from employment that needs to be completely unilateral from the employer, with the consideration that the employee was still willing to work. So while that may seem very clear cut, it brings up some particular gray area instances, such as maybe somebody who has gone on military orders for a duration of years and the employer decide to exercise their right to let them go. Do they still qualify for continued coverage? For things such as, don't like to use the term, but when somebody's been essentially constructively discharged or asked to resign, the employee at that point may have a certain argument that they may qualify for continued and subsidized coverage on that front. So I think that's going to be something that may see some developments here in the forthcoming months and years. And then additionally, exactly what exact circumstances will allow local governments to get their federal assistance for their COVID-19 connected loss of revenues. While they have a very non-exhaustive list, the current guidance right now is, there just needs to be a reasonable connection. Well, what exactly is a reasonable connection, which creates some gray areas there as well. So while there's certainly a very specific list, such as, costs associated with testing sites or giving out vaccinations, there's also questions as to which workers are essential to their premium their premium pay, costs associated with that, which exact employees will qualify for receiving federal assistance for those types of costs as well. So I think those are 2 things, especially coming from the federal level as it distills down to the state, that are going to be pretty hot topics in the forthcoming months.
And I'll piggyback one question I'm hearing on the wage front, especially Chad talked about the American Rescue Plan Act, where all of you as government entities are going to get some share of that. You got to follow the administrative steps, which, Treasury does. U.S. Department of Treasury put out even new guidance yesterday. So beyond the scope of our webinar, how to get there. But, one thing you can do is obviously pay some type of premium or hazard or COVID-19 pay to essential workers. Now, specifically, here's the legal weeds, but relevant in Minnesota. The law expressly says you can go retroactive. You can basically give them retroactive pay for the hazards they had to endure during the pandemic. However, you have to balance that with Minnesota law, which is a general proposition. Now, again, there's exceptions. We can't provide retroactive pay. That is, we can't pay you more for what we committed to you before you did the work. So we can't go backwards and say, well, for all those hours you logged in during the pandemic, especially in the front line as public safety, EMS, et cetera, we're going to give you X lump sum payment or hour for hour paying additional amount. Now, the problem is, again, under Minnesota's law, specifically the public purpose expenditure law, that basically says, what does it flow from? The Maine Attorney General's opinion was we can't give bonuses. We can only give extra money beyond the base wage we committed is if we said that in advance and we told somebody, here are objective measures that you have to undertake, and then we'll pay you more than the base pay. So that's where it flows from. Now, in the union environment, it gets different, but and I do know that unions are aggressively asking for that. But here's practical reality, because this is legal la la land. Federal government said expressly we can give retroactive pay, but you talk to Team Legal and says, no, we can't do that. That's not a public purpose expenditure. So what do you do practically? If hypothetically, let's say per a law enforcement officer, and again, all of you have had different amounts, so I know this is not a real world example, but I'm just trying to give an easy one. We basically want to compensate our law enforcement, our EMS, our firefighters an extra $1,000. We want to give them a lump sum for their pandemic pay, and it's, that's part of how we're going to spend our American Rescue Plan Act money. So we say this, all right, if that's your goal, why don't we do this? Why don't we just say, again, we're still in the pandemic, for work going forward, and because times were tough, we couldn't pay you, going forward, we're going to pay you an extra $50 an hour. Or going forward on the next paycheck for working the next 2 weeks, we're going to give you $1,000 lump sum. Now, again, I know the optics aren't the best, the PR, but that's what we're advising our cities. You want to reward them, but we didn't. In Minnesota, you can only reward them for something you said in advance you would. So that's an easy way to do it. Take the $1,000 you're going to give them, say, all right, on the next paycheck for your next 2 weeks of work, we're basically going to pay you the $1,000. So that's the cleanest way to avoid this whole retroactive pay and trying to reward them for past work. Another question came in on, again, on the wage front, and this relates to PRA, when an employee qualifies, because it's, we have seasonal temp exemption related to how much money they make and or how much time they work. So we haven't done the full scouring. Chad mentioned the omnibus pension bill. I don't think, unless Chad jumps in and seen something otherwise, I don't think there's been any legislation that's actually moving that'll change it. Because again, we emphasize the point, if you want to hire 14, 15-year-olds and or retirees, especially for the seasonal temp jobs, we don't want to increase how much, especially now we have to get more competitive as the minimum wage goes up in Minnesota with inflation, that we don't also want to have to pay PRA. But so I do think that is a good way to, that will be an important thing that has to be addressed at the legislature. But to that question, we're not aware of specific legislation. Another one, I think I've already addressed it, talked about cities, counties paying law enforcement a quote unquote bonus. We talked about that's illegal, but you can take, a lot of you are going to be dealing with this because I know the unions will get aggressive with it. They can say what they want, but again, I know a lot of you probably want to reward them. And again, just reward it for prospective work, not retrospective work. But I do know a lot of entities are considering that for law enforcement and other essential workers, providing some type of additional pay. So, Chad, I know we're talking fast, but any other questions you're seeing from folks or what you want to tell us about on the state and federal legislative or regulatory end?
Nothing more specifically.
All right, how about Christina, anything in the COVID-19 world you don't think we've sufficiently covered that you're getting questions on?
I see a few questions in here related to COVID. So the first one that I think we kind of glossed over was, is an employer liable if an employee gets ill from vaccine if they require it? Meaning, either that those couple of days after you get the vaccine, those symptoms, or even just very ill from the vaccine. The answer is probably yes, or could be. It's likely, or it could happen based under, workers' comp. Of course, we haven't really seen any of those cases yet, but it's definitely a possibility if the employer is requiring it. Obviously, if it's not required, then that issue wouldn't be at play. And then the other question was, are many local governments requiring the vaccination? So just want to kind of make the distinction. So local governments in terms of the employer front. So as you guys did the survey, you could see that most people were not requiring the vaccine, but rather recommending it, which is, our recommendation of the way to go, at least now when we don't have a bunch of information in terms of the ramifications of that. In terms of actual local governments requiring the vaccination, I would say it's the opposite in the sense that I'm seeing a few states, state governments saying that employers cannot require the vaccination. I believe there was legislation in Montana. So I think that it's going to go the opposite way. I think that there's going to be bars on employers requiring the vaccination rather than governments actually requiring the vaccination at this point.
And I just want to make sure we're scrolling through the questions. Feel free to chime in with more. So can I be real? I want to get back to mechanically because I know we get questions in the union world to talk about using, especially now where it's going to be ripe, your American Rescue Plan Act money to pay your essential workers something more. So there's always the debate, well, do we have to meet, negotiate, and get an agreement from the union on that? Well, yep, it sure sounds like you are obviously modifying their compensation and giving them a payment. So what am I doing? I mean, let's just talk efficiency and practical reality. I think as employers, let's face it, I think that's one of those topics you want to control that. So even if you need to meet, negotiate, and get agreement from the union, practically, how are we executing that? We're saying, all right, what do you want to do? What's the payment? Local government X, of what we want to give essential workers. We say, let's just do this. We can have an informal quick chat with the business agent or business representative saying what we're thinking, saying, yeah, we can talk about it, but just so you know, we're probably just going to draft a memorandum of understanding that specify that, specific, like, for example, law enforcement, all those folks within your bargaining unit are going to get X. I'll take the $1,000 example. We'll apply it prospectively. So you can say business agent or rep, we can again chat about that, but you just want me to send you the draft of the MOU. And if you're good with it, we can chat. Otherwise, we'll just have after that, and you sign it, we'll have our governing body approve it. So you get it. It's one of those, because you have it, the unions are going to get aggressive with it. Try to have practical reality. To be blunt, we're just not, during the pandemic, when we didn't know where our funding would go, unions seemed a little more aggressive in asking for hazard pay. You're going to see some of that, but again, our view is, all right, use the employer, you control the parameters of that, you control the drafting, and to be honest, it hasn't, in the rare occasion we've done it, it just hasn't resulted in much discussion or even pushback from the unions. So again, that's a good mechanical way to implement that piece. And then another question related to wages is interest arbitrators. Where do we think they'll go with the pandemic and this one-time money? As the slide indicated, we've only got a handful of awards recently. So again, even from my end, the anecdotes support the data. We're just not seeing the unions at all really genuinely threatening arbitration. Now, I know some of you may have it pending. We always hear that, but again, data and anecdotes show they're not getting aggressive. So where precisely arbitrators have gone, again, we just got a little indication, is the best argument you have right now is, which is true and genuine. It's volatile and uncertain. Especially, for example, school districts seem to have taken it the worst with funding and pandemic. And so you've got some inability to pay, but again, going forward, we get it. Things are looking a lot better on your economic and financial front than they were last year, or that you projected they would be. So again, emphasize that at the table, and that's the type of talking point in the one-time money. That's the type of talking point that'll hopefully keep you out of interest arbitration, which substantially all of us have been able to do. So Chad or Christina, any other questions on the COVID front or federal state front?
I don't see any more for federal or state updates.
All right, so again, a couple administrative things. We'll let questions come in till 11:30, but as we put at the end of our presentation, there's a slide for resources, especially COVID-19. A lot of you are talking about preparedness plans. We are going to update ours, have not yet, now that the mask mandate's no longer in place and the work from home is no longer in place. And then there's another question about a remote work policy. Ours is evolving. We tried to do the quick, let's get through COVID-19, not make it structural remote work guidelines, but we are going to be working on an enhanced hybrid one as well. So in addition to updating the preparedness plan, we are going to look at an enhanced remote work policy and guidelines that takes into account, it's not just sole remote workers, but those are doing the hybrid, a mix of being in the office versus working virtually, because that will be a big deal and is an evolving issue and something that we're working on. So clearly go to the CGMC website, especially the COVID-19 link. For those of you who are members or are looking at, if you're a city, we are having our summer conference in person late July in Alexandria. Then on the third point, a lot of you have been loyal participants in our webinars. We likely are going to be looking at one maybe late-ish summer to give some additional update, but as we know, sometimes things just stagnate in the summer even though you're in the midst of budgeting, but we try to give you the tools and the talking points. And again, as always, Flaherty and Hood's available for any representation, advice, or working with you on any analysis on any of the issues that we covered or any labor, employment, HR things. So again, this will be available, the recording and the slides. You'll get the email. It's going to be available on the CGMC website and YouTube. And again, we want to thank all of you for participating, asking your questions, and keeping engaged. And good luck in our volatile and uncertain times. So again, we appreciate it and thank you, and have a good remainder of the week.